The marble chamber of the Supreme Court trembled with quiet gravity. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her navy suit sharp against the mahogany glow. Cameras clicked. The air felt electric. Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his eyes cold as he spoke. "I've read your brief 3 times, Congresswoman, and your understanding of constitutional law seems elementary at best." Silence followed, heavy and cutting. Crockett's jaw tightened. She did not flinch. "Justice Thomas," she replied evenly, "I appreciate your concern for my education, but in the next 5 minutes I'll show exactly why your assessment is not only wrong, but dangerously misleading." The court froze, 9 justices still as statues. History was about to turn. Justice Thomas leaned back, voice echoing through the marble. "Perhaps, Congresswoman, you should revisit the basics before appearing before this court." His words sliced the air like a gavel. Crockett remained still, only the faintest flicker crossing her eyes. She had trained for moments like this. "With respect, Justice Thomas," she began, her tone calm but deliberate. "My understanding is not under review. The Constitution is." Reporters exchanged glances. Justice Kagan's brow lifted slightly. The confrontation had shifted from questioning to challenge. Crockett drew a single page from her folder. "If I may," she continued, "this case isn't about theory. It's about who gets to vote and who doesn't." The tension crackled. Thomas's lips pressed thin. For the first time, the chamber felt like a battleground. Thomas's deep baritone filled the chamber again. "The Constitution guarantees equal treatment, not convenience." A few conservative justices nodded. Justice Alito leaned forward. "Where in the Constitution, Congresswoman, do you find a right to vote without identification?" The question was sharpened steel. Crockett's eyes didn't waver. "The Constitution protects citizens from laws that pretend to be equal but cause unequal harm," she replied. Her assistant, seated behind, slid forward another document. Justice Sotomayor leaned toward her mic. "Let's focus on real evidence," she interjected. Thomas interrupted smoothly. "Before evidence, let's clarify principles." Crockett inhaled slowly. Around her, marble and history pressed close. "Then let's clarify both," she said. Her words landed like a stone in still water. Subtle, but irreversible. Reporters scribbled furiously as the verbal duel deepened. Thomas's tone grew firmer. "Data can be manipulated," he said, "but the Constitution cannot." Crockett nodded slightly, unfazed. "And yet," she answered, "laws can manipulate results while claiming neutrality." Her words drew a faint murmur. Chief Justice Roberts shifted uneasily. "Congresswoman," he warned softly, "please continue." She lifted her hand slightly, acknowledging him. "Respectfully, Mr. Chief Justice," she said. "I'm nearly there." The chamber held its breath. Her voice found new weight. "If the Constitution's text is to remain our guide, we must also face its consequences in practice." For the first time, Thomas said nothing. His silence thundered louder than his voice. Crockett adjusted her microphone slightly. "Justice Thomas," she said, "you've questioned my understanding several times. Allow me to address your concern by examining this court's own history." She lifted a new folder, color-coded, meticulously organized. "Within these pages are the patterns of constitutional interpretation you've personally advanced." A flicker passed across Thomas's expression. He straightened. "Proceed," he said flatly. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Crockett's tone sharpened. "We analyzed every voting rights opinion you've authored since 1991. What we found may surprise the court." Every camera fixed on her. For the first time all morning, Thomas's confidence seemed to waver. The duel had turned, and everyone knew it. The chamber felt smaller now. Crockett's voice carried with controlled precision. "In preparing for this case," she said, My team examined every voting rights opinion you've written or joined since 1991. Thomas' eyes narrowed, his stillness masking unease. We weren't seeking ideology, only consistency. A ripple passed through the gallery. Justice Kagan leaned forward, intrigued. Crockett flipped through her notes deliberately. Your concurring opinion in Shelby County v. Holder argued Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional from its inception, yet in Allen v. Milligan you dismissed data on ongoing discrimination. She paused. The contradiction is not in the Constitution, Justice Thomas. It's in the application. Every word landed like a measured strike. The silence grew thick. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson exchanged a look with Justice Sotomayor. Part astonishment, part admiration, Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. In Crawford v. Marion County, you upheld voter ID laws for the sake of integrity, despite little evidence of fraud. But in Arizona v. Intertribal Council, you rejected federal oversight, favoring state sovereignty. The principles shift, Justice Thomas, depending on who benefits. Thomas's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. The court's energy had changed. This was no longer a routine argument. I'm not here to win an academic debate, Crockett said quietly. I'm here to defend the right of every citizen to cast a ballot freely. Even the marbles seemed to listen. Thomas finally spoke. Consistency requires fidelity to text, not emotion. His tone cut like glass. Crockett nodded once. And yet, Justice Thomas, it's emotion that built the Constitution's promise. A few reporters caught their breath. You once wrote, she continued, the Constitution means what it meant when written. But tell me, does it mean that Mrs. Wilson, who's voted for 70 years, should be silenced by a name mismatch? A murmur rippled across the gallery. Justice Roberts looked up from his notes, surprised by her directness. Thomas's brow furrowed. Crockett's voice softened. Words have power, but so do their consequences. That is where law meets humanity. The quiet after her statement felt sacred. Justice Alito cleared his throat. Congresswoman, your appeal borders on policy rather than law. Crockett met his gaze calmly. With respect, Justice Alito, the law becomes meaningless when policy erases the people it's meant to protect. Her words hung like a blade. The justices shifted. The moment was raw, electric. We cannot interpret rights without acknowledging their erosion, she added. Her assistant silently placed a new chart before her. These aren't abstractions, they're Americans. The camera lights from the press flickered faintly. Thomas leaned forward, clasping his hands. Show us then, he said. Crockett nodded. Gladly. Every heartbeat in the chamber synchronized with hers. Crockett unfolded the chart, revealing a timeline spanning 3 decades of Thomas's rulings. This, she said, is the evolution of your constitutional interpretation. Justice Barrett leaned slightly forward, curiosity visible. From originalism to selective textualism, your reasoning shifts to suit context. Thomas's lips tightened. The document shimmered under the courtroom lights. These inconsistencies aren't flaws of intellect, Crockett continued. They're reflections of how easily the law bends when we ignore those it harms. The gallery was silent, every camera focused. Justice Thomas, you taught us to read the Constitution as written. Today I ask only that we read it as lived. The chamber had grown so quiet that every shuffle of paper echoed. Crockett's tone softened. Justice Thomas, she said, you claim the Constitution's text is your compass. Then allow me to anchor this case in the people that text was meant to protect. She lifted a small blue folder. These are sworn affidavits from 173 Georgia voters denied the right to vote. Among them, Mrs. Dorothy Wilson. She held up a faded photograph of an elderly woman, eyes bright beneath wrinkles carved by time, 86 years old. Voted in every election since 1956. Turned away because her ID carried her married name. The silence was absolute. Even Thomas looked away for a moment. Crockett placed the photo on the podium with reference. Mrs. Wilson was born under Jim Crow. She continued quietly. She marched with Dr. King, and in 2024, she was told she could not vote. The words vibrated through marble and history. Justice Kagan's pen stopped mid-note. Chief Justice Roberts lowered his gaze. Thomas's hand flexed slightly on the bench. Crockett pressed on. The Constitution's meaning doesn't change, Justice Thomas, but its interpretation must recognize its citizens. A flash from a journalist's camera broke the stillness. When laws silence Mrs. Wilson, Crockett said. They silence the very promise the founders wrote in ink and blood. Thomas shifted in his seat, his voice lower now. You suggest inconsistency where there is interpretation. Crockett met his eyes, and interpretation without empathy is inconsistency of a different kind. Justice Jackson smiled faintly. Her pen paused midair. This court, Crockett continued, has long upheld equality under the law, but equality without access is illusion. The statement, linger, you taught that the Constitution must not bend, she added. Yet today, you bend its shield away from those it was meant to protect. Thomas inhaled slowly, the weight of the words pressing into his silence. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Congresswoman, Chief Justice Roberts interrupted gently. You have 10 minutes remaining. Crockett nodded. That should be enough, she said. She glanced briefly at her assistant, who slid her final page forward. Justice Thomas, she continued. You once wrote that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because the data no longer justified its use. She leaned slightly closer to the microphone. Today, new data shows discrimination persists. By your own logic, it demands protection. A murmur moved through the benches. The symmetry was undeniable. Crockett had used his own philosophy as her weapon. Crockett's final words cut through the still air. Respectfully, Justice Thomas, the inconsistency isn't in the Constitution. It's in selective fidelity to its meaning. Thomas stared at her, lips slightly parted. If defending access to the ballot makes my understanding elementary, she said softly, then perhaps this court needs more elementary thinking. A ripple of stunned silence followed. Justice Jackson's faint smile returned. Even Thomas's usual composure fractured, his expression unreadable, his authority for a moment human. Crockett closed her folder slowly, her movements deliberate, graceful. The duel had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat, breaking the long silence. Your time has expired, Congresswoman Crockett. His tone was formal, yet softer than before. Crockett nodded. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. She gathered her papers with deliberate calm. Justice Jackson gave a subtle nod, a rare silent acknowledgement. Across the bench, Justice Kavanaugh leaned toward Barrett, whispering something under his breath. The press gallery stirred, but no one dared speak aloud. Crockett stepped back from the podium, spine straight, gaze steady. The tension in the room shifted from confrontation to quiet awe. For the first time in decades, the Supreme Court chamber felt transformed, not by ruling, but by truth spoken aloud. The next advocate approached the podium, but his voice trembled. The momentum had vanished, replaced by the weight of what had just occurred. Thomas's gaze remained fixed on the papers before him. Chief Justice Roberts glanced toward him, sensing something unusual. Thomas, the court's most unyielding originalist, was silent. Reporters slipped quietly from the gallery, typing furiously into phones. One journalist whispered, "This will be the story." As the argument continued perfunctorily, Crockett returned to her seat, her assistant whispering. "You changed the room." She said nothing, but inside she felt the shift. The power of truth meeting the architecture of law. Outside, the Supreme Court steps glistened under the late afternoon sun. Reporters flooded forward as Crockett emerged, flashes blinding against marble. "Congresswoman!" one shouted. "Were you prepared for Justice Thomas's attack?" She paused, then answered evenly. "I came to defend voting rights, not my resume." Another question cut through the noise. "Do you think your exchange will influence the decision?" Crockett smiled faintly. "That's for the court to decide. I simply presented the facts." Her voice carried authority, wrapped in composure. Cameras followed as she descended the steps, the crowd's murmur rising like distant thunder. The story had already begun to spread. Within minutes, social media ignited. A CNN correspondent tweeted, "Unprecedented. Rep. Crockett turns tables on Justice Thomas. Most direct challenge I've seen in 20 years. Screens lit up across the nation. Hashtags #Crockett v. Thomas and #Elementary Thomas trended before she even reached her car. Inside newsrooms, producers cut segments mid-broadcast to run the footage. Commentators debated. Was this defiance or brilliance? At her congressional office, aides huddled around glowing monitors, disbelief giving way to pride. "They're calling it historic," one whispered. Crockett stood by the window, Washington's skyline reflected in the glass. "No," she murmured. "It's overdue." As night fell, every major network replayed the footage. Legal experts filled panels, parsing every word. On MSNBC, one commentator said, "Crockett didn't confront power. She redefined how it's challenged." On Fox News, a conservative analyst admitted, "She attacked philosophy, not person." That's hard to dismiss. Harvard Law's Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Whether you agree with her or not, this was masterclass advocacy." In living rooms, Americans watched a rare moment of accountability unfold live. Inside the Supreme Court, lights still glowed through high windows. Somewhere in chambers, Thomas sat alone, papers untouched, the echo of Crockett's voice still hanging in the marble air. By morning, America was awake, not just to headlines, but to history. News anchors replayed the moment Crockett turned the chamber silent. Commentators' voices overlapped in astonishment. "She dismantled a Supreme Court justice with precedent," one said. No theatrics, just law. Across the nation, offices paused, classrooms tuned in, living rooms filled with quiet admiration. At the White House, aides watched the replay again. "She didn't argue for politics," one whispered. "She argued for people." The president's statement came hours later. Brief, cautious but telling. "Robust legal debate strengthens democracy." The story had already outgrown Washington. Our viewers portrayed in tour. On social media, her words became anthem. Hashtags #Crockett v. Thomas and #Elementary Thomas trended across every platform. Law students shared clips captioned advocacy 101. Civil rights groups reposted Mrs. Wilson's story with messages of solidarity. In university halls, professors analyzed her logic frame by frame. "She built an argument like an architect," said one scholar. Even conservative circles conceded respect. "She struck at inconsistency, not ideology," wrote a columnist. By nightfall, every network carried the same image. Crockett leaving the court steps, sunlight catching the edge of her folder like a torch. In newsrooms, producers scrambled. "Clear the schedule. This is the lead." Panels formed instantly. Conservatives defending Thomas's philosophy. Liberals celebrating Crockett's challenge. Yet, amid debate, a rare consensus emerged. Respect. On MSNBC, Neil Katyal said, "She didn't flinch before power. She used law as mirror, not weapon." On Fox News, a conservative analyst nodded. "She attacked inconsistency, not character. That's real advocacy. Across the spectrum, viewers felt something long missing. Conviction without spectacle. For one fleeting moment, the country agreed on integrity. That evening, the clip reached over 10 million views. Donations to voting rights groups surged. Universities invited Crockett to keynote. Law students cited her in papers. In her congressional office, aides celebrated quietly. "You broke the internet," one laughed. Crockett smiled, weary but grounded. "No," she said. "We just made the law visible again." Outside, D.C. glowed beneath streetlights and screens. From the marble steps where the confrontation began to the crowded feeds of millions, her words had crossed from chamber to conscience. By dawn, print headlines sealed the moment. The New York Times, Congresswoman redefines courtroom power. The Wall Street Journal. Crockett's calm precision exposes judicial contradictions. Law schools added her transcript to syllabi overnight. Cable hosts called it the most consequential 5 minutes in modern advocacy. But for Crockett, it was simpler. She looked out her office window toward the Capitol, whispering to herself, "It's not about winning a case. It's about keeping the promise." In the reflection, her steady eyes met the city's morning light, determination glowing brighter than marble. Weeks passed in silence. The nation waited. Commentators speculated daily. Would the justices fracture along ideological lines, or had something shifted? In closed chambers, clerks whispered of unease. Chief Justice Roberts pressed for moderation. Justice Barrett questioned the data's dismissal, and Thomas, uncharacteristically quiet, reviewed Crockett's affidavit again and again. "We can't ignore evidence," Roberts said softly in conference. Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the page showing Mrs. E. Wilson's testimony, an old woman's steady handwriting reminding him what jurisprudence had forgotten. Law without humanity is hollow. The marble walls held their breath. When the decision day arrived, the crowd outside stretched across the steps. Inside, the clerk's voice rang clear. "In the matter of Richardson v. Election Commission of Georgia." The justices took their seats, robes rustling like wings. Chief Justice Roberts began to read the majority opinion, his tone steady, deliberate. "The court finds certain provisions of Georgia's voter ID law create unnecessary barriers to voting." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. 6-3. Decision reversed. Crockett closed her eyes briefly, exhaling disbelief. The nation had expected another defeat. Instead, it received nuance and a hint of redemption. Reporters erupted outside the building. 6-3. Chief Justice Roberts writes for the majority, another shouted. But one detail silenced the chatter. Thomas's name among those concurring. His paragraph was brief, a single page, but it would echo across legal history. "While I maintain that the Constitution's text provides ultimate guidance," it read, "I acknowledge that faithful application requires consideration of effects on citizens such as those who testified, for once even as critics." Paused. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. Crockett's words had become part of the record. That evening, Crockett stood before flashing cameras again, but this time no confrontation awaited her. "This decision isn't a victory for me," she said. "It's a victory for Mrs. Wilson and the thousands like her." Reporters leaned in. "Does Justice Thomas's concurrence surprise you?" one asked. Crockett smiled faintly. "No, I think he remembered what the Constitution was meant to do." Her words weren't boastful, only certain, rooted in conviction. Behind her, the Supreme Court's marble steps glowed gold in the setting sun. The law, for one rare moment, had remembered the people it served. Across America, headlines collided. Justice Thomas shifts ground. Voting rights restored. Crockett's challenge redefines courtroom advocacy. In classrooms, professors debated whether one woman's argument had altered constitutional discourse. And May. In Georgia, volunteers began registering new voters again. And in his chambers, Thomas sat quietly, the echo of Crockett's words lingering. For once, he didn't reach for precedent. He reached for reflection. Sometimes the Constitution doesn't change, but the people interpreting it do. Outside, democracy exhaled. 6 months later, cameras flashed again, not in a courtroom, but in a university hall. Crockett stood beneath the Howard University Law School banner, addressing a packed auditorium of students. "What happened in that courtroom," she said, "wasn't about me or Justice Thomas. It was about whether our legal system can still see people beyond the text." Applause broke out. "The Constitution isn't static ink," she continued. "It's a living promise." A student raised her hand. "Do you think you changed his mind?" Crockett smiled softly. Not his philosophy, but maybe his perspective. The crowd rose, their applause echoing like the chamber's marble reborn. Back in Georgia, voter registration drives multiplied. Church basements buzzed with new energy. Civil rights groups reported record donations. "They're calling it the Crockett effect," one organizer joked, handing out forms. On television, law professors debated the ruling's long-term implications. But ordinary citizens cared about something simpler: the right to vote without fear. In classrooms and coffee shops, people repeated her line. The Constitution wasn't written to be an abstract exercise. It was written to protect people. In a country weary of division, the echo carried like a hymn. Crockett founded the National Voting Rights Institute, dedicated to collecting data and helping citizens overcome bureaucratic barriers. At the launch event, she stood beside a banner reading, "Data, Access, Democracy." Her first hire was a young lawyer trained to help elderly voters navigate ID systems. "We're not here to argue the law," Crockett said at the podium. "We're here to make it real." Donors applauded. For every law journal quoting her exchange with Thomas, there was a family in Georgia, Alabama, or Texas who could now vote with dignity. That was the legacy that mattered. In a small church basement in rural Georgia, Mrs. Dorothy Wilson stood before a circle of first-time voters. Her voice, steady despite age, filled the room. "I've been voting since Eisenhower," she said, holding up her new ID card. "And thanks to what happened in that courtroom, I'll keep voting as long as the Lord lets me." Applause rose, quiet but profound. Outside, magnolia trees swayed in the evening air. For Mrs. Wilson, the Constitution was no longer distant parchment. It was a promise kept, and for the students listening to her story, it became a call to action. The nation moved on, but the echo of that courtroom confrontation lingered. Historians called it a constitutional awakening. Students studied it. Citizens remembered it. In interviews, Crockett deflected praise. "The real heroes are the voters," she always said. On the steps of the Supreme Court, 1 year later, she paused beneath the same marble columns. The wind carried faint sounds of traffic and distant bells. "Elementary," she murmured, a quiet smile crossing her face. "Maybe, but sometimes truth is." The camera pulled back, marble turning to sky. The story wasn't an ending, it was an awakening.